Hello and welcome to ORU's Media Equipment Office. I'm Matthew Simonson, I'm a student worker here, and today we are going to be covering the Canon T4i. The T4i is kind of an entry-level camera. For the freshman and sophomore classes, for film directing and producing, for basic photography classes, we're going to be using more advanced cameras as you go deeper into the CTD major. But for now, we've got these T4i's, and we've got 8 of them here in the equipment office. So the T4i's come in these little bags right here. And when you open the bags, the first thing you'll want to do is to check to make sure that everything you need is inside them. This beautiful Canon T4i, and there's actually a checklist of things that you will need. It is right here. And as you see, it says that you've got the camera, the lens, the batteries, the charger, tripod plate. We typically check out a camera with a designated tripod. They just kind of go together. So you'll just want to make sure that between those two that the plate is present. A USB cable and a UV filter, and that's specifically to protect the lens. All of those things should be present when you check the camera out. This is the lovely tripod that goes with the Canon T4i. And you'll see that it has a number here. This one says B4. We have 1 through 8. And the number here should match the number that is on the camera's bag. And we can see that fortunately it does. So this tripod is a little bit different than probably a lot of the tripods that you've used in the past. It doesn't have any spreaders. So it just comes straight out like this. You'll attach it, you'll pull it out, and then just like latch it in place. I like to make sure that this middle section is down all the way, because then there's more spread on the legs. It's just a little bit more stable that way. And then for these purposes, I'm going to just spread it out to this height. And I'm going to place this right here. Now we've got the plate right here already, so we know where that is. And then we're going to screw it onto the camera right here. You've heard it said a lot that you want to make it finger tight. In this case, you want to go a little bit tighter. If you have a multi-tool, that's great. I usually use the blunt side of my keys to just tighten it just a little bit. It's also pretty common to use a penny. And then we are ready to mount this camera on the tripod. And before I do that, you want to make sure that it goes on the right way. So there's an arrow that shows that we'll have to slide the plate in this way. So I put it on backwards. So we're going to need to loosen it just a little bit and turn it around. So the arrow is going to line up with the arrow that's on the tripod itself. And we're just going to slide it in and then tighten this little knob right here. Now this one we're going to want to make finger tight. Don't make it too tight, otherwise you might risk stripping it. And then I'll usually want to adjust the arm a little bit. You can adjust it to whatever height you want. And our camera is ready to go. First, of course, is the lens cap. Right here we've got a 18 to 135 millimeter lens. Some of the cameras in the MEO have an 18 to 55, but if you're doing videography, it really doesn't make a whole lot of a difference, because if you get much further than the 55 millimeter, most of your shots are going to be really shaky with this grade of camera. So we've got the lens here, we've got the compartment for the SD card. It pops in and out just like that. Over here we've got audio input, microphone input, AV out, which you're probably not going to use too much. On this side of the lens, we've got autofocus versus manual focus switch and image stabilization. And then on the top, we have the main control center. So with this switch, you'll be controlling whether the camera's off or on, and then whether or not it's in video mode. Obviously with us, we'll be using video mode mostly. These are all pretty much just presets. For what we're doing, we're going to stick to manual. Right down here, we'll have to probably unmount it for this. We've got the battery compartment. Battery's right here. It's best not to keep the battery in when you're not using the camera, because that'll corrode the image sensor. So when you're finished, just pull it out, tell the worker which battery you used, obviously, so that they can charge it. And then when you're using it, you can just pop it in like so and place it back on the tripod. Now when you go into the menu system of this camera, the first thing that you need to know is how to format the card. So we're going to hit this menu button right here because that'll access most of our controls. And you'll scroll to the yellow screens and you are going to see Format Card. You'll hit that. You have the option here to use a low-level format or just a regular format. I would suggest using low-level format all the time. A lot of people will say low-level format takes longer. It really doesn't when you're at this level. So we're going to hit OK. And you're ready to go. Now when we go back out of the menu into video mode, and before we get into any of the videography elements, we need to make sure that this top dial right here is set to manual exposure. Automatic exposure will get you a pretty good approximation, but for any videography, manual exposure is going to get you a better result. And right now I'm seeing that I have a flashing battery signal right here, so this is a very good illustration of how you will know when you need to change the camera's battery. Turn this top switch to off, unmount the camera, open this compartment, take out said battery, the cap on the battery that you just took off, and remember which one it was so that you can tell the worker here which one to charge. Replace battery like so, and remount on tripod. Now when we go into these menus, in order to access them, you have to hit this Q button. When you open these menus, you can scroll up and down to access all of your different options, and the right and left will help you to choose within each submenu, and then the Set button will select it. For autofocus, you've got the Flex Zone Multi, Single Point, and Face Tracking, which is a really cool feature if you're setting up a one camera setup and you just want to shoot yourself and don't have a crew. You can just plop your camera right here, it'll focus on your face by itself. We'll set that back to the multi-zone. This next submenu is Drive Mode, which is basically just for photography, so we'll kind of skip over that. This is the recording mode for photography. Movie recording size is really important. You've got 1080p at 24 frames per second, and then 1080p at 30 frames per second, which is what we'll most of the time use here. You also have 480p and 720p at 60 frames per second. So if you wanted to do something slow motion, you could record it at 60 frames per second and then in post just slow it down. Video snapshot, that's not really useful for what we're doing. This is a back button. Here is where we're going to be dealing with color temperature. Got a whole bunch of presets here. You've got presets for cloudy, shade, daylight, and then we've got auto white balance, which is usually hit or miss, but it is faster. And then you've got custom white balance. If you have a situation where you don't really want to use a preset where it might not be accurate enough, or you just want to have a lot more control over what your image looks like, you can use this custom setting. We have this custom white balance setting, and the way that you would use it is you would take a photo of something that is white, typically a sheet of paper, under the lighting that you're going to be shooting in. So for example, I could use these walls. It would be better to use a piece of paper, but I could use these walls right here because they're white. Snap a picture of it. I have a picture on this SD card that I can use to manually white balance it. So I'll go into the menu, scroll over to where it says Custom White Balance. Hit the Set button. It'll say only compatible images are displayed. The picture that we just took is compatible, so it displays it. And we hit Set again. OK. And now, when we exit the menu, our picture is white balanced to this room, which is what we want. The next entry on this menu is Picture Style. We're probably not going to use that very much. And then there's Auto Lighting Optimizer, which isn't as useful. Now that we've set up the white balance for the scene, I'm going to take a look at exposure. And when you're dealing with exposure, there's really only three things that you need to keep in mind, which are the three things that are known as the exposure triangle: shutter, aperture, and ISO. All three of these elements affect how bright the image is, and when you bring up the exposure one way, you're going to have to bring it down another way to compensate for it. So it's this constant game of trading back and forth to try and get the image with the exposure that you want. The ISO is located on a dedicated button at the top of the camera. When you press that button, you can see a menu of options that opens up, and usually for quality imagery, it's best to stick around 800 That can be flexed a little bit. It's better to flex that down than up because as you flex up, you're going to get more graininess. That's the drawback to boosting exposure with ISO. The next element of exposure is shutter, and the shutter can be manipulated through this little wheel right here. Now the shutter, when you're doing videography, is more limited than it is with photography, because with videography, you've got a set frame rate. The shutter speed needs to be, for lack of better terminology, double what the frame rate is. So if you've got a frame rate of 24 frames per second, the shutter needs to be 1/48. If you've got a frame rate of 60 frames per second, the shutter generally needs to be 120. This is potentially flexible, but when you boost the shutter up or down, you're going to be affecting the motion blur on the camera. The third way to affect your exposure is to manipulate the aperture. And you'll do that by holding down this AV button and turning that same shutter wheel. You might notice that the numbers on this little indicator right down here are changing. That represents the f-stop. If you've got a lower number, this camera goes down to 3.5. You will have a wider aperture, which lets more light in and makes the exposure brighter, but you have a more shallow depth of field. If the number is higher, like this goes up to, I think it's 22. Yes, it goes up to 22. And if you set it to 22, then your depth of field is going to be really long because the aperture is going to be really closed, but you will also have a really low exposure. With DSLR cameras, you're going to probably need to do this outdoors, but of course it's too dark for indoors right now, so we are going to bring it back up to 3.5, and now we have a relatively well exposed image. And of course, the final thing that you need to know is that when you are ready to start recording, you're going to hit this record button, and that will cause the camera to start recording video. And you'll hit it again to stop it. And then finally, when you're all finished with what you're going to be doing with this camera, you will turn it off. You'll want to unmount it from the tripod. You'll take the plate off, which you can do if you have either a multi-tool or a penny. I prefer to use my keys sometimes, and then it gets loose enough it can just be finger loosened. You'll take that plate off. And as always, you will take out the battery because you do not want to corrode the image sensor. You'll remember which battery that you use so that your MEO worker can plug it in and be very happy with you. And you'll want to close this little flap right here, put the lens cap back on, and very carefully place said camera back in the bag. And you'll also want to take down the tripod. You'll do that by pulling out these levers, sliding it in on all of the legs. These tripods are a little bit wonky because they don't have any spreaders. You'll make sure that this top section is completely extended, and then you'll pull these little latches out and snap in the legs like so. You'll unscrew this little arm and put it in a position where it'll be compact and can easily fit inside the tripod bag. The plate will go back on. You'll want to tighten it so that it doesn't get lost or something. You'll put it back in the bag. And then the last thing that you'll do, of course, is you'll bring it back to the MEO, they'll scan it in, they'll have you sign on the paperwork, and you'll be free to go. And you'll be very happy knowing that you have just created a beautiful project with the Canon T4i. Hope you have a great day. See you next time.